Thank you, sir, for the introduction. It is a joy and an honor for our family to be back here with you all. I know Ruth, even coming here, was saying she missed Darliston sometimes, and it feels good to be back. It is good to see. So there's faces that I recognize, and then there's faces that are new. And just like as I came onto the property, there's lots of things that look familiar, but then there's some things that are new. And I appreciate that. What that reminds me is that God sustains and cares for those things which we've had, but God also is building and continuing to do new things. And so it is good to see both the old, or the things not old, you're not old, but things I recognize and things I don't. I'm much older than when you last saw me, so that is okay. But we are glad to be here with you all and to share in today with you. And we've been, even though we have not been here, we have been pleased to hear the stories of God's grace and goodness that He has been doing at Darliston. And we praise God for what He is accomplishing, what He is doing here. And it is good to be with you all. What I want to share with you as we open the Word today is we read Romans chapter 8, and I want you to have that in mind, this idea of setting your mind on something. But to help us understand that, I want us to kind of separate a few different things about our minds. See, first of all, sometimes we know things, but just because we know things doesn't always mean we choose to use our knowledge. That would be a few different reasons. So, for example, I know that Scotch bonnet peppers are hot and the oil on them, right? We know that. But sometimes I'm cooking, I'm cutting a pepper, and I go and I just do a little quick highlight. Yeah. Right? Now I know I shouldn't do that, but it just slips our mind sometimes, right? And then we get to experience the joy of trying to get that oil out of your eye. And that happens to us sometimes. Sometimes we know things, and yet we just by accident or by just not thinking for a minute, we'll make a bad choice. But Romans chapter 8, when it talks about setting your mind on something, it's a little bit different. That's when you know things, but we make choices to ignore the things that we know. And that is much more of a challenge. And some of the things that we struggle with so much more. So what I do today is kind of go back and look at a story of somebody who experienced this challenge, knowing something, but then making poor choices. And by looking at this story, I want us, where you look at this story, you may be familiar with the story, where you look at it with this new light, and try to help us to see and realize the sorts of things that we do, where we know things that we should or should not do, that we make choices otherwise. And we'll just give you a more practical example with the oils. I know, so when we were coming here, we were leaving the boat here in Montego Bay, driving towards and turning down a long hill. Now, if anyone's driven much from Montego Bay up here, we know that right there by Long Hill, I don't know if you're familiar, the police often make a little speed checkpoint right at the bottom of Long Hill. Anybody been seen that before? So sometimes we as drivers, we know that, but we'll choose to act as if that's not going to be a problem this time until someday it is. That's the sort of times when we know things, when we make choices that aren't always good. What I want to do is have you can open your Bibles and turn, or we can pull on the screen to the book of Daniel. Now, we have some great stories throughout the Bible, and there's some stories of what I call redemption stories, where somebody's life is turned around. Those are really great stories. I think of Nicodemus. He was a man who went to Jesus in the middle of the night. He was scared, but he had questions. And Jesus shared with them about what it meant to follow Jesus. And in that story, we got the wonders of John 3:16. God taught that to Nicodemus. Well, when Jesus is killed, crucified on the cross, and buried, as Nicodemus who was there burying him. We see that Nicodemus is a man his life was redeemed, it was changed. And so those are great stories. Well, there's an amazing redemption story that happens in the book of Daniel. And I want to walk you through that story because we see the story play out we're going to look at is somebody who came after the story and what they should have known. So this story is about a man called Nebuchadnezzar. Now, are you familiar with the name Nebuchadnezzar? We know some of these stories, but I want to kind of weave them together for you in such a way that we know what is going on. Because pretty much Daniel 1 through 5 is this amazing story of God changing the life of a man, and then somebody else who should know better not learning their lesson. The things that they know, the things that they have knowledge about, they don't make the right choices. And the reason this is important, the reason we're going to talk about this, is because for some of you who are sitting here, maybe you've grown up or been in church for a long time. And maybe if you haven't, growing up in Jamaica, we have an amazing access to stories from the Bible and songs. In school, we sing and we hear. We have devotions, many meetings. We have devotionals before. And so, for a lot of us who are sitting here, we have the opportunity to know a lot of things about God. The question is, what do we choose to do with that? How do we choose to live? So let's look at briefly this. So like I said, I'm going to take you through the story of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you want to follow along, you can, but I'm going to try to weave a lot of things together quickly. If you guys know me, you know sometimes I like to take big stories and synthesize them. So we're in Daniel chapter 1. We're only briefly introduced to Nebuchadnezzar because there's a man named Daniel. He has 3 friends. They're captured from their home. They're taken to Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar is the king. And they are told to eat certain foods they don't want to eat. And they make a choice that they know this is wrong. There you see that idea coming. They know something. They make a choice from it. And they choose to do something different than everybody else is doing. And at the end of Daniel chapter 1, they are brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. And here's where King Nebuchadnezzar really gets to meet Daniel and his friends and get to know their God more closely. And we find out in Daniel chapter 1 at the very end, in verse 18, it says, they brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king spoke with them, and among all of them was none found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, you commonly know those other 3 people as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't know these names as well, but it's the same individuals. So Nebuchadnezzar meets these men, and he realizes there's something different about them. At this point, he's starting to get knowledge about God, but it doesn't change him. So then we get Daniel chapter 2, and at this point, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it's very upsetting, and he tries to get people to explain it to him, and nobody can, and so he's getting very upset. But finally, Daniel is brought in to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel is able to help Nebuchadnezzar by explaining to him, interpreting the dream. It's a statue of different metals, and we're not going to talk about all of that. But at the very end, we realize Daniel, and Daniel chapter 2, verse 46, it says, Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face, and he paid homage. That means he honored. Did he honor God? No, not at this point. He honors Daniel. And says, truly your God is the God of God, and Lord of kings, revealer of mysteries. So at this point, he says, your God is pretty good. So at this point, he's realizing that Daniel's God is powerful, but at this point, it is still what? Your God. So at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, he's met Daniel. He's realized Daniel's value. Now he really sees that Daniel has access to a wonderful, powerful God. But that's somebody else's God. That's somebody, it's not his. It seems like it's nice, but that's for you. And sometimes, maybe you have been there, or you know someone who likes the idea of church and God, but that's not for them right now. I don't know if that's you here today, but that's kind of where Nebuchadnezzar was. God seems good for you. You do your thing, that's fine. I'm not going to trouble you. Seems to be going very well for you. So that's where Nebuchadnezzar is in chapter 3. Well, the problem is Nebuchadnezzar really liked the idea of this dream. Because in the dream, he was told that in this statue that had a head of gold, he was the head of gold, right? That sounded really good to him. He's like, all these other people are going to come after you, they're not going to be as good as you. You're the best there ever was, and there never is going to be anyone like you ever again. Well, he thought that was a great idea. So he decides, I'm going to build a statue of myself completely out of gold. And he started, he called the NWA, the National Works Agency, to build him a statue. And I don't know how long it took them, or if they outsourced to the CHEC. But they built the statue. As you know, that's a China hardware engineering company. That's good. And so they built this gold statue, and then we have him commanding people to worship it. And then the angel's three friends, we know this story. This is a fiery furnace story. They decide that they are not, once again, they know what is right and wrong, and they make a choice to do this. And so he throws these three men into the fire, and then he is astounded that they're not burned up. And at the end of Daniel chapter 3 now, verse 28, once again, he says, blessed be the God of who? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel to deliver his servants, who trusted in him. So now he understands that this God is powerful, and trusting in him makes a difference. So now Nebuchadnezzar sees that there's a powerful God, he's able to do great things, and your response to God is what brings you into correct relationships. We see that these men trusted their God, and God delivered them. Now, he's watching this story play out. And you think that he's getting closer and closer to understanding what's happening to Nebuchadnezzar. He's learning things in his head. He's seeing God at work. He's seeing God doing things around him. But at this point, he's not actually changing his mind. He's not setting his mind, changing his mind. So bear with me. So then we get to Daniel chapter 4. And in Daniel chapter 4, something really fascinating happens. Right? Daniel chapter 4, if you look at it, is actually written by who? Look at the first few verses and see who wrote Daniel chapter 4. Anybody see? No, we can talk at church. It's okay. Who's writing Daniel chapter 4? Nebuchadnezzar is writing. Now, Daniel took Nebuchadnezzar's writing, included in this book, but he took what it looks like Nebuchadnezzar's own letter. Because it starts, King Nebuchadnezzar to all peoples, nation, languages, 12. Verse 2, it seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. Alright, get this? We have seen Nebuchadnezzar gradually learn about God, and now a chapter of the Bible is written by Nebuchadnezzar, and he's talking about what God has done for himself. This is no longer the God of Daniel. This is no longer the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is what God has done for him. And we find out as he writes this story that once again he has a dream, and it's very upsetting. And once again, Daniel is brought in to interpret the dream. And Daniel has to tell him that, unfortunately, unlike the other dream where you got to be the head of gold, this dream is not too good for you, king. It has some bad news for you. You are going to be humbled by God directly. And we realize Nebuchadnezzar didn't take this to heart, because we find out in Daniel chapter 4, verse 29, that Nebuchadnezzar's out for a walk one night. He's looking around Babylon. He's looking at the great things that have been built. He's looking at all the things that he has accomplished. And he makes this statement where he says, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power? And we find out that while the words, while he's still speaking that phrase, that God humbled him. He took his kind of mind away. He went out and lived as a wild animal for quite a long time. And at the end of this time, now he's out as a wild animal, he's living as a beast. And I want to read at the end of Daniel chapter 4. It says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason, and I bless the Most High. Basically saying, I praise and honor him who lives forever. And he writes this phrase, this kind of song, his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. Now remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar, who just lost his mind when he talked about what he had done. Now he's saying, God is the one who endures. His kingdom lasts. His kingdom reigns. His dominion is what's eternal. His kingdom is what matters. And all the inhabitants of the earth, you know who he's putting in that category? All inhabitants are considered nothing. He's putting himself in that category. He is learning these things. And he is restored. We find out that at the same time his reason, his kingdom, his majesty, his splendor, his counselors, and his Lord Solomon, he was established. And at the very end of chapter 4, the last words we get from Nebuchadnezzar are this. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So at the end of these 4 chapters, we go from Nebuchadnezzar learning about God, seeing God at work, keeping a distance from God until God brings Nebuchadnezzar to a point of breaking him, humbling him. He goes out and lives with the cattle on the field until he realizes that God is the one in control. God is the one who gives him his kingdom. God is the one who takes kingdoms away. And Nebuchadnezzar falls on his knees, honors and humbles and gives his life to God, and writes this chapter that then Daniel includes in the Bible for us. Is not that an amazing story of God's redemption? Of taking this powerful king who thought he was great, he didn't get the one who conquered Israel and Jerusalem, overthrew God's kingdom. He thought he was in control, but now he realizes that his life, his prestige, his power, all of it came from God, and God could take it away. So he changed his life around. Now, for the most part, that's the end of Nebuchadnezzar's story, but I don't want this to be about Nebuchadnezzar. But we have to see Nebuchadnezzar's story. We have to realize what happened in his life to understand Daniel chapter 5. Because that's really where I want you and I to stop. Because the fact of the matter is, if you are sitting here today, if you're either a visitor or you've been here a while, you have gotten to see God do great things in the past. Yes. You have learned and you know, and even now maybe you've heard and seen even this building, and all of us sitting in here, even these chairs. One of the kids on the way asked me today, do they have comfortable chairs? And I said, well, actually they do. I remember going to Kingston to get them from the harbor. You know, and we got them, and we were so pleased to have them. They become kind of commonplace now, right? We forget how awesome it is to have these chairs. But that's the thing, is we see God at work. We know those things. But the question of the matter is, does that change your life on a Monday, a Tuesday, a Wednesday? So let's look at Daniel chapter 5. Now, this chapter, you might see it as the handwriting on the wall. But we're going to not really talk about handwriting on the wall. What I want to talk about is the individual. Now, this is either a son or a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. His name's Belshazzar. And in Daniel chapter 5, what he does is he decides to have this big party, this big feast. And there's nothing wrong with having a party. Most people like a good party. So he's having this party, he's having a feast. But in this party, he chooses to do something that is very offensive to God. What he does is he goes into the storehouses of all the things his dad conquered. Now remember, he's kind of growing up riding the coattails of his dad, Nebuchadnezzar. So he goes in the store and he pulls out these cups and plates that used to be used in the temple in Jerusalem. These were holy items, consecrated and set apart for God's work. Now, he brings them out to use in a party. Now, we all know about consecrated things, right? there are certain plates and cups our mothers only get out for what? Special occasions, right? If you were to sometime when she's gone, get that out to just squeeze out your bag juice into a cup, and then she comes in, what's going to happen to you? You'll end up very sore for the next week or so. So we get the idea of consecrated special things. Now, these things have been taken from God's own temple. They've been stored. Now, Belshazzar gets them out and starts using them at his party. And at this point, then, there is a finger that comes and writes on the wall. And he doesn't know what it means. And he's getting very upset. And what's fascinating here is that it's not his advisors who come to him at this point. We find out the queen comes to him in Daniel chapter 5. And she kind of assures him, and basically says, there's a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. I'm in Daniel chapter 5, verse 10, 11. And it says, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom of the God who founded him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made him chief, because he had all these different things. So he's kind of being reminded, your dad really, really respected this guy Daniel. You should go get him. So Daniel comes in, and Daniel is introduced, and Belshazzar says, I've heard about you, Daniel. Right? He says, I've heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you. Light, understanding, and wisdom are found in you. What does that mean? Belshazzar knows about Daniel. But it goes further than that, because there's a little phrase that's going to happen here as Daniel starts talking, because Daniel now recounts for Belshazzar the story of his father. He's going to give the story of Nebuchadnezzar. And you can go look at this later in verses 17, 18, 19. It talks about what happened in Daniel 4, about how Nebuchadnezzar raised his heart up, but he was humbled, he was brought down, and all of this, he says he was driven from his mind, he was fed grass. Verse 22 and 23 are very important, because Daniel says this, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. You knew all of this. What that means is that Belshazzar knows the story of his father. He knows what manner of man his father was. He knows what happened to his father, how he became like a wild beast. He knows that his father turned and repented and put his hope and his honor and his worship to God Most High. He was restored, and he wrote it all down as a record. He kept that. It was recorded, and Daniel sits there and says, Belshazzar, you know this. You knew the story. You knew about this God. You knew what he did to your father, and you knew the proper response to this God. But you, Belshazzar, you knew all this. However, verse 22, you, his son, have not humbled your heart, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of the house have brought in, praise the God of silver and gold. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And what happens here is Belshazzar is a man who grew up in a household, in a culture, in a society that the general public pushed and pushed him towards pleasure and seeking out and having a good time and doing whatever he wanted. But he has a personal testimony, example, and a reminder and story of what happened to his father. He's seen that. He knows it. But what does he choose to do? He chooses to act how he wants to anyway. And this is where we then have to turn our minds back to Romans chapter 8 and really take the lessons we have from this. See, the fact of the matter is we, like Belshazzar, live in a world that generally tell us to do what is best for us. Whether that's how we drive, how we shop, what we wear, all of those things, we are prone to desire what is most comfortable or enjoyable to us, right? I don't know, maybe you're not like that, but I know that's the tendency of my heart, to desire the things I want to do, the things I want to get ahead. I was challenged yesterday. I realized I had to be pointed out I was wrong. There was some traffic, and somebody was trying to get over my lane, and I just was not letting them in. Why? Well, I was asked that question. I had no good answer. Because the answer is, I just want my way. I want to be first. See, that is the heart attitude we wrestle with every single day. But the fact of the matter is, what challenges that is the things that we know. And that's where Belshazzar was. He knew this story about his dad. He knew that his dad lived for a time right while down. Was he alive at the time that happened? We don't exactly know whether he really remembers it, but it could not have been something that was all that of a mystery, right? If one of our MPs of our country suddenly went crazy and was living out on the road as a wild man, would most of us hear the story about it? We would. Now, I know Belshazzar probably, he was older, so he didn't have WhatsApp. He might have been using Facebook or MySpace or something. He was a few generations back. But the idea is he knew about it. He knew. He understood. He had the knowledge. But it's not the choice he made. And so then he is told, your kingdom will be taken away from you. And when he hears that from Daniel, you know what he does? He says, well, Daniel, I'm going to make you like number 3 in my kingdom. Can you imagine Daniel being like, didn't you just hear me? Later on tonight, you're not going to be in charge. So you making me number 3 really doesn't mean anything. When I wake up tomorrow, there's going to be a new boss in charge. But yet, here is Belshazzar still not understanding that there are consequences to his actions. There has been a judgment prescribed to him, and he still is resisting and fighting and trying to live as if he's in charge and he knows what's going to happen. So why does this happen? Well, we can go back to Romans and we'll finish there. That's why we read this earlier. Is Romans 8 is a wonderful chapter. If you ever want to memorize a chapter of the Bible, this is one that's really good to memorize. Because it starts with this phrase, there is therefore now what? No condemnation for those who are in Jesus. The very end, it talks about how that there is nothing that can take us away or more than conquerors, and all these things can separate us from the love of God. Those are wonderful. But in between those two wonderful promises is this idea that you and I are what we set our minds on. Do you set your mind on the Spirit, or do you set your mind on the flesh? Now be careful. This is where I want to be careful. It's not what you know about. That's where knowing and setting your mind are two different things. You need to connect your knowing with what you do. And sometimes we do this in little ways. So this morning, I was using a soap dispenser, and it ran out. And so I was about to throw it in the trash, but you know what I know about myself? I forget things. So instead of putting it in the trash, I set it on the counter. So when I get home later today, I'm going to walk in the bathroom, I'll see it, and I'll be, oh, I need to get that, right? So I know I forget things a lot. And so what did I do? I had to make a choice to do something different because of what I know I'm like. That is setting your mind on something. So what does that mean for my life in relation to God? Well, the fact of the matter is you and I are a lot like Belshazzar. You say, well, I'm not having a party with God's sacred dishes. No. But here is what we do. If we've been to church, if we've grown up in this country, a lot of things, we sing a lot of songs about how great God is, what Jesus has done for us, the amazing offer of grace and the gospel that is available to us, and we are called to live not according to what we want to do, but according to God. The fact of the matter is, if you've been here, you've probably heard that before. You know that. But we so often neglect that we still every day wrestle with the flesh part of us. See, the flesh part of us. The reason God turned Nebuchadnezzar into a beast is because when Adam and the woman ate of the tree, they were, more things were revealed to them, but what happened is that mankind became more like the animals than they did like God. The Satan had told them, you'll be like God. But the fact of the matter is, they became more like animals. Why? Well, what do animals do? Most animals just pursue food, sleep, procreation, and avoiding danger, right? And we use those things to train animals, right? We give our dogs treats, and because they want treats, we can train them to do things. Same thing happens to me. If you offer me treats, I'll do a lot of different things. But see, we are prone from our fleshly desires, right? You're sitting here, it's 12:30. Some of you are starting to get this little rumble in your tummy. Anybody? And when we get a rumble in our tummy, what do we desire to do? To satisfy our flesh. Now, that's fine. That is what we should do. If you don't do that, you're going to have a challenge. But the fact of the matter is our desires come at us. Our desire for comfort, for food, for relationship, for belonging, for all these different things. We crave certain things, success, power, prestige, whatever it is. We crave it, we desire it. And when we just pursue what we want, we are pursuing the flesh, the animal, the beast part of nature of who we are. And the problem is, pursuing the flesh, Romans 8 says, leads to death. And that's what it was for Nebuchadnezzar. That's what it was for Belshazzar. And he knew that there was a choice that had to be made, and he chose not to make it. And it led to that very night, his death. But it leads to death because if we are slaves to our fleshly desires, we then are a slave. We are just doing what we want to do, and then if that changes, we do something else, and we always do that. But Romans 8 is challenging us with this idea of setting your mind on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. Think about Daniel in the same situation with Belshazzar. Daniel knows the power of God. Belshazzar knows the power of God. Two men, same knowledge, same room, realize the same thing. That night, the government's going to be overthrown. There's going to be a new king tomorrow. Do you see fear from Daniel? No. Why? Because Daniel repeatedly sets his mind on the things of the Spirit. Because Daniel realizes that the one in charge is not Belshazzar who's standing in front of him, and it's not whoever's going to show up in the middle of the night to overthrow the kingdom. That's not who's in charge either. See, Daniel knows that God and His Spirit are in charge, and as long as he obeys them, the turmoil, the overthrow, the difficulties in life are lessened. He has life and peace. You watch that in Daniel's life as Nebuchadnezzar goes through these rises and falls, and he turns on Daniel, turns on his friends. Later on, Daniel, after that happens, Belshazzar, what's going to happen in the next chapter? What's the next, if you know what Daniel 6 is about? The next guy who gets in charge ends up having to throw Daniel where? In a lion's den. Once again, you think about the story, and I'm just using that as an example. Daniel knows what's right and wrong, and what does he do? He hears, don't pray to anybody else. He sets his mind on the things of the Spirit, goes, opens his window, prays like he always does. And he ends up in the lion's den. You're like, this is not a good illustration But the fact of the matter is, Daniel knows who's in charge. So he goes there with peace, and he comes out of the lions. We love the story, but it's that buildup of that idea of there's a difference between the people who set their minds on God and those who set their minds on the flesh. And the fact of the matter is if you have been in church, if you've grown up, and I'm speaking to you right now, we so often get these habits, these ruts of life. Even church can be a habit, or that's just what we do. We go to church on Sunday. That becomes a fleshly activity. You say, well, going to church can be a fleshly activity? It can. If you're just doing it because that's what your habit and regular doing, that's a fleshly motivation. The fact of the matter is, we have to choose to set our minds on the things of the Spirit. That means I can tell you, I told you about 8 Bible stories in one sermon. You probably say, that's way too much, Caleb. That's okay. The idea is you can know